Alright, so let's get this started. Let's get this show on the road. We're going to talk about the EU funding debate. I've probably heard it like 40 times now at least. Like most rounds talk about it. I judged 30-something here, 20-something in San Jose. And honestly, I feel like there's like a lot of things that are just happening in the debate that just get conceded. So most of the time the uniqueness is just agreed upon and we never get past the surface level. But there are some rounds where teams have competing interpretations, and I think it's important to really understand the nuance of the funding debate, because I'm not sure that you're going to have every round where the norm is just that like the BRI is collapsing, or the norm is that like the EU can fund the BRI. There are definitely going to be rounds on your local circuit or against opponents who didn't go to NDF that are going to have a different perception of the topic. And this funding collapse debate is, I think, one that like we really strongly pushed here. Since day one of San Jose, it's been one of the most common arguments. But now I think it's important to understand the nuance of it so that way we can succeed later on in the season. So, before we get into the specifics of the debate, I think that there are a couple key levels. Well, that's exactly not the lecture. I think there are a couple key levels to understand about what this is going to cover. So the first is about whether or not the BRI is collapsing, right? The second is whether or not the BRI needs the EU. The third is whether or not the EU can actually fund. And then the fourth is any tangential links that come from the BRI being able to or not being able to fund in the round. And I think that it's necessary to understand all components of this debate so that way any assumptions that you make can be challenged, and any assumptions that your opponent made can either be defended or challenged, really depending on what side of the uniqueness you're on. So first, is the BRI collapsing? I think that the general consensus at camp and the majority of arguments I've heard is that the BRI is collapsing. The BRI has a funding gap, they're on a path of failure, they're not going to be able to borrow indefinitely. The only responses to funding gap failure that I've gotten have been twofold. The first is a time frame response, which says yes, it's going to collapse, but it's going to collapse far down the road. It still has plenty of time left. And the second response is that they're able to borrow indefinitely, so there won't be a collapse. But I think that the reason as to why it will just like fizzle out way down the road is because they basically were able to borrow the entire time. In fact, in the round where both of those responses were read, the team conceded that the first response on time frame was contingent on the second one being true. So I think whether or not the BRI is going to collapse, the only response I've heard to the BRI not collapsing is debt, and like the ability for China to borrow indefinitely. Has anyone heard a different response about the BRI not collapsing? So like the only time that the opponent ever challenged you on whether or not it was going to collapse is they basically responded that Xi would be able to borrow indefinitely.
Well, a response that I've heard is like private investment is going to increase in the future, and the only reason it's not high right now is because the BRI is a relatively new project.
Awesome. We'll get into that later. That's actually going to be like the third slide or so, but that's good evidence to have, good knowledge to have on the topic. What's up?
One was like G will just cut back costs so that the BRI can continue to go.
Hey.
One item was like the BRI is at an all-time high in investment right now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Hey. So the last responses I've just called for, I can't validate if they're true or not, but I can tell you that first, it's important to know that BRI investment being at an all-time high probably means that like coming from China and from other institutions is predicated on the legitimacy of the project. International investors are only willing to and are comfortable investing as long as they feel that the project is viable. And then secondly, with the private investment link, private investors are unlike states in the fact that like they cannot they cannot have a large sum of debt that they just keep building upon. Because a lot of the debt that they take and a lot of the debt that they have, if it grows to be too large, either one, they won't be able to pay back, so they get seized or shut down, and basically their assets get paid back to the institution that they lent to, or investors within those companies grow so unconfident that they feel that they can no longer support that business, and so it's a really bad business practice. So the main response, and I think the most well-warranted response, is that China will be able to borrow indefinitely and Xi will want to borrow indefinitely. So there's no reason that it's going to collapse because China would have to force a default on itself. However, there's just like two ways to challenge this assumption. The first is to assume that Chinese banks are particularly strong. In fact, just last night, the People's Bank of China had to get bailed out for the second time in 1 month, and other investment banks in China, specifically for the BRI. So, for example, the EMB or like the EXM, their export banks and their export investment banks are also running dry on funding, and they're not really able to give out loans anymore because their credit rating is getting decreased. I think what's really important to note is that now that these banks are struggling, it shows two problems. One, international confidence will probably take a hit. When your own financial institutions that are bankrolling a project have to get bailed out, that's not a great sign. So like the perception that private investors will join or will stay is predicated on the perception that the BRI is a viable project. But if Chinese financial institutions are collapsing in the moment that is most important in getting international financing, that's going to be really problematic for China. It's probably going to hurt their chances of bankrolling the BRI on their own, as well as bankrolling through private investment. And then secondly, I think that even if these institutions don't collapse, even if they get bailed out, these bailouts can only happen if you have excess reserves. And something that has been conceded because it's fact is that China's reserves have decreased, they've experienced capital flight, and they've lost over 25% of their total reserves due to this capital flight. So they won't be able to keep bankrolling these bailouts, they won't be able to keep throwing money at problems, because if these problems keep returning, eventually they're going to run out of money to throw at it. Does that make sense? So like, right now the situation in China isn't necessarily one where like there's an impending doom scenario or recession. It's just one where the financial viability of their overextension, right? Because the BRI is China extending into new areas and investing in new areas is very limited. I think that if China doesn't show any change in policy action or an inability to like change the way that they start funding these projects, then they're like heading down a spiral that isn't very good for their ability to continue this project. I think with the banks collapsing, with the $500 to $800 billion funding gap, depending on what evidence you're citing, the most recent one by the Council on Foreign Relations is $800 billion, so maybe cite that one just because it's bigger. Like China is in a pretty precarious situation where the only way that they would continue to fund these projects is if they can afford to go into the negative, and right now when they go into the negative, it's not looking too good. What's good? What's up? What's your name?
Daniel Yang.
Okay, Daniel Yang. So, okay, we are all good to go. So, that settles whether or not the BRI is collapsing. If the EU doesn't join, is the BRI going to collapse overnight? No. Is the timeline of the BRI looking to be a very good thing if the EU doesn't join? Let's get into that. So, the second crucial question is whether or not the EU by joining can actually save China from these structural problems that they're encountering. And the reason why China has these structural problems is not just a factor of their own government system, but also because of a lack of oversight. In China, a lot of these banks, a lot of these institutions aren't run by the central government, right? They are banks that operate within certain provinces or certain regions of China and are able to use their excess revenue that they have abroad. So you have a lot of provincial governors, you have a lot of provincial party members, and you have a lot of mid to lower level party members who are in charge of these financial institutions that are giving out loans abroad. The problem is that the reason why they're giving out loans abroad is to advance their own career. Because the BRI is now a part of the Chinese constitution, and because Xi has staked his legitimacy on this foreign policy geopolitical expansion project, there is a perverse incentive for members in the lower level of government to appease members in the higher level of government by supporting them. So even if the project isn't necessarily viable, they still have an incentive to give out loans because they advance their own career, right? If I'm a lower level party member and I want to get into the National People's Congress, or I want to get into some higher level of the Chinese government and I want to have some actual influence, I need to get in tight with the people at the top because they're the ones who are promoting me, pushing me up through the ranks, and basically accepting me into this like high level of government. So even when the financial viability of the projects is low, even when the return on the projects is low, there's still a really bad incentive for the government to give these loans, which is why, for example, in Malaysia, a provincial governor, one of these smaller banks that was giving out loans, took a $50 billion project to build a high-speed rail. And so the way that they got that contract is they competed with Japanese investors in order to build it. And the way that they won the contract is by saying, you know what, we'll just charge you incredibly low interest rates, no overcharge on the labor, we'll provide all the resources and materials, we'll handle all of it, you just have to pay us back. And Malaysia was like, oh sweet, this is a tight deal, I don't have to pay interest on this loan, so even though I have to pay them back, it's not really all that much. They're providing the people, they're providing the materials, I'm just chilling, right? I'm just sitting back, I'm able to relax while China handles all the hard work. But when you are signing on to these deals in order to advance the project in your own interest without considering what the long-term implications are, you only end up hurting yourself in the end. That's why the same project that was being built in Malaysia didn't even get off the ground because they didn't have the labor, they didn't have the money, and they didn't have the viability to even start. So you know who's building that $50 billion contract yet again? Japan is, right? So even though China might be offering better incentives, if they are doing it at the sake of viability, they can't even undertake these projects in the first place, so they're not going to witness any economic growth. And if they're only building these projects for the sake of building projects just to advance their career, that's why teams are able to get up and read that half of the projects are unprofitable, or 2/3 of the projects aren't having as much traffic as they were projected to have. A lot of the inefficiencies within the system arise from the innate corruption within the system itself, within the Chinese government, and within the perverse incentive to basically advance your career regardless of the cost. So whether or not the EU can save it really depends on the structural problems and the issues within China. But let's just skip that for a second, right? Let's just assume that because you're limited by 4 minutes, right, because you can't give a 40-minute lecture, you can't get that deep into the problems of China's government and into their ability to fund. Let's just look at it on face value, right? The BRI needs money. Does the EU have the ability to save it? I think that at this point in time, as a judge, the topic literature I've been exposed to tells me yes. And the reason why comes from Kieran. I think that the Kieran evidence is the most cited, but most misrepresented piece of evidence on the topic, and I think that teams aren't doing enough good work with it. I think that they have a really good asset that they're not using to its full potential, because the Kieran evidence does two things. The first one is it creates a comparative between the EU and their lending practices abroad to the rest of the world and their lending practices abroad. Kieran finds that the EU has invested $953 billion abroad, and over 50% of that investment in total has gone into BRI countries. So the EU has already demonstrated a willingness to invest in poorer countries that need infrastructure, and they've invested a great capacity to do so. If teams keep running that the funding gap is $500 billion, the EU is literally doing nearly double that. So you would only need to access partial solvency from the EU side in order to access solving back for the funding gap. I think the Kieran evidence is pretty good in that regard. But then secondly, Kieran also establishes a unique sort of advantage, which a lot of teams are reading Kieran that other institutions won't join. You need stable institutions before international investors get confidence and are actually able to invest. And I think what Kieran goes on to explain is that because they invest so much abroad, the EU has a long track record and precedent of success with their loans and their investment. So the reason why other institutions feel comfortable after the EU joins is because unlike China, where the BRI is really their first attempt at international expansion and lending, the EU has already been doing it, so they already have a good reputation. I think it's important to note of the $953 billion that the EU has invested abroad, over 50% has gone into BRI countries. Of the $748 billion that the rest of the world has spent abroad, less than 50% has gone into the BRI countries. So even if you were to isolate Chinese funding, even if, say, 75% of China's funding went into BRI countries, right? And I would say that's a pretty high estimate for China. It still doesn't even compete with the level that the EU invests abroad. So they also have the unique ability of becoming the largest or an equal co-financer within the project. Are there any questions up to this point? Yeah.
I don't understand why the EU can't just invest in BRI right now. Like, what's the uniqueness you get by like doing BRI?
That's a good point. So they can invest right now. One of the reasons why they aren't doing so is because of like the geopolitical concerns of the BRI. They fear like Chinese expansion into their own territory is problematic because they worry about the security implications of their expansion. I think some really good evidence for this is Greer. Greer talks about how 270 projects were put on hold or canceled entirely, and the projects that were put on cancel or hold were the ones that weren't considered geopolitically viable. In other terms, China didn't see themselves getting a security or power projection benefit from these projects, so they decided not to bankroll them. I think one reason why the EU is probably fearful right now is because of that. Now, of course, by affirming and saying they join, you have to win that they're willing to fund. But I think at the point where they sign an MOU that basically says we're on board with the BRI, chances are that they're probably going to continue their behavior, so they're still going to be a lender within the institution. If they're already lending right now, we're never told why the incentive to continue lending changes. And at the point where they've signed an MOU, the amount of cooperation that they do with China probably increases. I think that if we don't know, like, does anyone know what the BRI actually is? Does anyone have an idea of what they think the BRI actually is?
It's basically just like an overarching name for like any infrastructure project China wants to do with another country.
So like any infrastructure that China has pursued up to this point, they basically just say this is a part of the BRI. This is some fancy plan that we have to basically connect the global economy. We're going to be the hero that brings the developing world to the developed world, and we're going to basically counterbalance the West. And I think that the reason why that's so significant is because the only thing that the BRI actually does is has countries sign onto MOUs where they basically agree to the framework of the BRI and they agree to the like development initiative. And so I think that if EU leaders join the BRI, they sign that MOU that basically says, hey, we will join your framework, there's going to be increased cooperation between the EU and between China because that's what their diplomats and that's what their like officials in government have agreed to do. So like, yes, they probably aren't agreeing explicitly to fund, but at the point where they're already funding abroad, now that you establish more cooperation, I don't think that it's too unreasonable of a stretch to assume that they will continue their investment with others. Yeah.
Like how does like increased cooperation increase their capacity to fund it?
So that's another reason why I think it's important to read evidence. Because the Kirtan card is really good in saying that the reason why infrastructure works isn't because you build a lot of it, it's because the infrastructure you build is interconnected. And so I think what's really important to know is that like the EU, when they take current loan offers right now, there isn't some broad overarching project. Technically the Juncker plan is a thing, but the Juncker plan is just being put into existence, and it still is like one and done projects where it's like, oh, you want to build a coal plant, here's the money for that coal plant. Oh, you want to build a solar farm, here's the money for that solar farm, right? Whereas what the BRI does is they say, oh, you want a coal plant? Okay, I have a better offer. You know, this coal plant won't really help you if you don't have a power grid to distribute that energy. And it also doesn't help you if you don't build a road so that way workers and materials can get to that coal plant. You know what, we might as well also build a railroad so that way the coal coming from our country can also get to you in a fast and efficient manner, right? So like the interconnectedness of the infrastructure is far more important than the actual net amount of infrastructure. And the reason why that gives you some unique advantage is because if the EU increases cooperation, their one and done, one shot projects that they're building right now are put under a framework where they're working with other infrastructure projects to have interoperability or more interconnectivity. I think that's a word that people throw around but they don't explain. And I think that the best example that was given was from Christian Vasquez when he explained that like, if the EU builds like a neighborhood, for example, right, it doesn't matter if they don't build the road or the driveways that connect you to your house, right? You don't really have ease of access. So even if it exists, you can't really use it. Whereas the EU right now, they build projects, but they don't build the factors that create interoperability and interconnectivity. They build the project itself, and then they just like allow the country to fend for itself. Whereas China, they build the project and then they handle any of the other factors that might cause that project to be less viable. So that's really what's tallying up their spending gap, because China is doing far more investment and far more thorough investment than other countries are. So that's actually increasing the cost of the project, but it also increases the possible returns of the project. I think that like when people talk about like BRI projects being bad, I think that that gets into a really deep conversation where I could probably talk for 2 hours to you about like the financial viability of these projects themselves, but given the fact that we have like a 40-minute lecture, I don't know if I'll have the ability to cover it. But even if you win that the EU can fund these projects, just know that there's a second layer to this debate, which is whether or not those projects are good. So like, if we want to have a discussion another time about that, I'm always willing to help, right? Like, I'm here to help you with that. But on the unique advantage, right? When I basically, the TLDR, long story short, the way that you win the uniqueness is you win more interconnectivity, and then you win that interconnectivity is the reason why infrastructure works. And so right now, the reason why EU infrastructure isn't as good is because it's not interconnected. It's just one and done projects that don't really help the communities they're put in. It's just giving people like one part of like a multifaceted problem, whereas the BRI attempts to address all of those facets at the same time. Does that make sense? I know it's not a very concise answer, and it's not really a short one that you can make in round, but like this is where something like Crossfire becomes important. It's one of those moments where you're able to go on that like 30-second response where you could explain it in shorter terms. You could give the TLDR that I just gave, and like I think that as a judge, that is a sufficient answer for myself. You might have to do some more warranting work, but that comes with reading more topic knowledge. So can the EU save it? Financially, they do technically have the means to save it. Some people say that the EU budget is smaller than the funding gap, and so that way they won't be able to address it. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the EU works. I think that, first and foremost, the EU budget is different from the sovereign budgets. So, yes, all 28 countries do technically have a shared budget for EU obligations, but then each of the 28 countries also has their own budget to spend on their own people. It's not like all of the EU's money gets put into one pool, right? The EU as a bloc is very different from each individual country's policies within the EU. So when we talk about the EU having the money to save it, we're talking not just about like the state budget for all 28 combined, we're talking about the individual ability of certain countries within the EU to finance. So when the EU joins and all 28 countries are pretty much on the same page that they're going to cooperate with China on infrastructure, then that gives you access to infrastructure specifically from countries like Germany, for example, who has the largest single budget of any European nation and is able to finance projects, right? So like with the Juncker plan, for example, that is a 28 country project that comes from the shared budget of the EU. But the shared budget of the EU is not the same thing as the sovereign budget of Italy, of Greece, of Germany, of France. And right now, what the topic authors like talk about is that these individual countries that are funding the BRI from the EU are the wealthy ones that have more capital and have greater revenue or greater budgets. So the company or the countries like Germany, for example, would be the ones that would do most of the bankrolling. The reason why that's significant is because a lot of people say, hey, 18 of the 28 EU countries are already in the project, so why aren't they financing? That's crucial for two reasons. The first is because they are the more poor countries in the EU that don't have the money to fund. They joined the BRI to receive funding. And then secondly, you need all 28 countries to distribute EU funding. So at the point where the wealthy countries aren't a part of the BRI, of course it makes sense that they wouldn't be funding because one, they don't have access to the EU budget. They don't have all 28 within the project. But two, they don't have any single state budget that is also large enough to fund projects. Is there any confusion with what we've covered so far? Okay, so why does this matter? It matters because one, once you establish that there's a framework for cooperation and you've given the sovereign budgets the ability to be used because these countries are a part of that framework, now all you have to do is use the evidence that you're already citing and explain the warrants of that evidence more. The current evidence is pretty damn good. Please use it. I promise you, I cut the evidence with my lab because we basically had a 2-hour discussion about this topic, and he answers a lot of the concerns that neg teams provide. But secondly, even if the EU can't save it, a lot of teams are still getting access to perception links like legitimacy, where they talk about the EU having the ability to like decrease the worries about other investors and increase investment from other sources, which I'll get into later. There is one flaw that I think can be very damning, and then there's one piece of mitigatory defense that I think is often mishandled that we should cover. The first flaw is that even if the EU has the capability to save it, you need to prove that they have the incentive to save it or that they're going to fund it in the first place. A lot of neg teams get up there and they challenge the assumption that the EU is going to fund, and they say no, the EU is just going to receive funding. Just like every other country that's a part of the BRI, there's no track record of a country joining and actually funding, right? And I think that's true. On face value, if someone gets up there and they read, oh, the BRI is going to get funded by the EU, unwarranted, and then another team gets up there and says there's no precedent of any country's funding other than China, I'm going to buy the precedent, right? Because you need to warrant your arguments. So if you're running that the BRI is going to get funded by the EU, you need to be reading evidence and warrants as to why that's true. So whether you're doing a deeper dive into the current evidence that proves that they already are like investing abroad, they have no reason as like to not continue this operation, or you go into the more analytical reasoning about like the MOU and increased cooperation, that needs to be coming up in round. Because even as a judge who has read into this extensively, if a team gets up there and reads, I'm not going to intervene, right? I'm not going to do the work for you that basically says the EU is going to fund, right? You have to do the warranting for yourself. But then secondly, people say, oh yeah, we'll concede that the EU is going to fund, but we'll challenge the assumption that they fund outside of the EU. One, the current evidence says that they're going to fund in the marginal areas outside the EU. So like, even if like your opponent gets up there and says the EU has no incentive to invest elsewhere, at least you have some carded empiric from an expert on the topic that says that they will. But even if they invest in the EU, one, there's still poverty in the EU, right? The EU still goes through recessions. There are still areas in the EU that have poverty. You can still access some offense. Just because people might not be living on $1 a day doesn't mean that they don't have bad living conditions. But then we also make this general assumption that Europe is some like great place to be, forgetting that for the last 20 years, back in the 90s, the literal southern part of Europe was being torn apart by civil wars, and the eastern part of Europe was literally under control of a communist government that was taking their revenue and not giving them anything in return, and millions of people were dying of starvation. So like Eastern Europe, who would be receiving funding from the EU and is a part of the EU, they still have millions of people in poverty. You're still accessing offense. So even if you're not necessarily accessing offense in like Africa, for example, or you're not accessing offense in like Eurasia, it doesn't mean that you just instantly lose the round, right? That's not how that works. It just means that maybe like the magnitude of poverty or like the severity of the poverty that you're accessing is less, but you're still improving the quality of life of others and you're still generating some economic return. So like far too few teams are ready to just concede that. And I don't know why. Because if you can win, even conceding that they're only going to fund in the EU, perceptually that's a power move. Because you're basically saying, you know what? Sure, we'll concede that we don't get access to all of our offense, and we're still beating you in these ways. That's a big slap in the face to that team. Because people think that they're pulling a fast one on you by basically being like, oh yeah, well you're only funding in Europe. And then you're like, congratulations, like there are people in poverty in Europe. Like, I don't understand the response, and I honestly think it's one of the weakest ones, but I voted for it twice now, because the other team just panics and goes, I guess they're only funding in Europe, and Europe is like a perfect place to live. Like, I promise you, like, there are structural problems everywhere. You can still access poverty solvency. I don't know why teams panic. So can the EU save it? Financially, yes. A lot of the evidence supports that they can. All that you have to do is prove that, one, they're willing to. You have to prove that they're willing to invest abroad. And two, you have to prove that those investments are basically going to the places that they're needed. because like if you're not getting any impact off of that investment, it doesn't matter. And you have to win that like they're not just going to be on the receiving end. So like there's a lot of like hoops that you have to jump through where if a team challenges you on the funding debate, right, be prepared to spend a lot of time explaining the funding debate because it's one of those things that gets very complex very quickly and there's a lot of levels to it. What's up?
Especially with like the coal plant argument. So
Yeah.
like let's say the BRI collapses, like so then what happens to like China's coal? Can they just like not build coal plants? Doesn't really make a lot of sense.
So like the BRI increases the capacity of China to export materials, right? You build the transportation infrastructure necessary to put the coal on the trains to send the coal abroad, or to put the steel on the trains or on the ships to send to the area where it's going to be used to build the coal plant, right? But like, I want you to know that like China was exporting materials and China had an economy before 2013. So like the coal plants that are already built don't disappear. It's not like BRI funding dries up and all of a sudden like the bridges built by the BRI the next day just like Thanos snap out of existence. That's not how that works, right? Infrastructure is built and the only way that infrastructure goes away is if it isn't maintained, so over time it falls into degradation, or if some like natural disaster like just takes it out. So like you're right that like China's still going to be able to export. The uniqueness of the BRI is that they're able to do more of it. So like the scalar impact is that they now have access to more coal, or they now have access to more materials. So if you're running over capacity, yes, China's still able to offload some of their overcapacity, but they're able to do it at a faster rate and a greater pace when they're in the BRI. If you're running climate change, right, they're able to export more coal at a faster pace through the BRI because they have the transportation infrastructure. If you're running energy poverty, right, which is basically just the converse of, or like the flip side of climate change, right, that's the uniqueness. The uniqueness here is that when you build the greater transportation infrastructure, when you increase the capacity to do so, now you increase the scalar effects, whether they're positive or negative. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Also, like, why can't China just build infrastructure in the EU right now?
So like, one, you like have to get like those contracts approved and signed. So at the point where the EU has worries about China's intent, right, that goes back to like the geopolitical versus economic scenario. And at the point where the EU is considered China a rival, they're probably less comfortable accepting infrastructure. But there are countries in the EU that are part of the BRI that have accepted infrastructure, so that also just factually it's not a true claim.
Like I think in like 2017, like Europe accepted like a deal for like a huge railroad that went from like London to like somewhere in China.
Yeah, so like, for example, like there's evidence, the first piece of evidence I cut on the topic that says that like the BRI already connects 34 European cities to 35 Chinese cities. Duisburg in Germany, 80% of all trains make their first stop in Europe in Germany. So even though Germany isn't a part of the BRI, they still get some access. The problem is that the flip side of that argument is that one, now the railways are getting congested, there's more traffic, because countries like Germany aren't willing to invest in new transportation infrastructure and all of the trains have to go through one town, that slows down the travel time, which is like the peak advantage of the BRI. Like all of the trade advantage evidence is basically centered around trade time. And then secondly, even though countries are able to accept deals, countries right now are also declining deals because they aren't comfortable. And so like that also is just like another reason that if they join and they have more cooperation, there's more on net infrastructure. Yeah.
Let's say you prove that there's an incentive for the EU to fund because they've already been doing so. How do you prove that they have the capability of doing it? Like,
So like because they're already doing so, that is the capability.
but like there are people that read evidence that right now they're like under by 200 billion or they're like in a deficit that they can't
The
fund.
EU is?
Yeah.
Okay, so like, now, I guess, one, I would say that like EU financial institutions are more stable than China. So even if China can't borrow, the EU isn't bailing out their banks every week, right? So like they're still able to go into some form of debt. But then secondly, if you're able to win economic growth off of the projects that the EU invests in, the way that you get out of that deficit or you get out of that shortfall is with growth. So like by increasing the economic growth and the trade and the economic viability of projects within the EU or outside of the EU, you increase the economic growth of the EU in and of itself. And so like even if they're in a deficit now, like that's why when countries go into debt, like the way that the United States gets out of like everyone here debated, or at least has some knowledge about like the debt versus economic growth topic. Remember how like the most common response was like, and basically the most common I think was AF. I don't know if that was the right side of the resolution or not, was basically like, oh, you grow to get out of debt, look what the United States did in the past. That's basically the response there, right? Even if they have a deficit right now, their growth is low right now. So by increasing the level of growth and by increasing the economic viability of these projects, then you grow out of that deficit that you're currently in. I think that's probably just the most straightforward response. But let's just make sure that we cover the rest of this project, or this PowerPoint. So, will others outside of the EU save it? This is like a twofold analysis. The first is private investors. There's evidence that says that half the BRI funding is going to come by private investors by 2030. I've read the analyses, I don't remember who it's from. I know that it doesn't take into account the EU joining. So you're probably going to use or lose some uniqueness about EU investors. But a better way to get access is concede. Sure, maybe half the funding comes from others, they still don't prove that they meet the funding gap, and you can win a scalar impact. Because the legitimacy link that we talked about earlier, that says the EU gives more legitimacy to the project, right? They have more stable financial institutions, their banks aren't defaulting, all of this stuff that's really a prerequisite to investors feeling confident in joining the project, the EU has. And so with that legitimacy link, the EU also increases the level of private investors involved. In fact, right now, there are a lot of European companies, and I found some empirics for this. I remember there's one that was a natural gas company that wants to invest in infrastructure in the BRI, but refuse to do so until they get approval by the EU governments, right? So until Germany supports the plan, or until France supports the plan. Because once your government runs approval of the project, that decreases investor fears about the project that they currently have. And so even if they are going to get some infrastructure investment from private companies, the app still has ways to access more on-net private investment because of more legitimacy. So if infrastructure is scalar, right, having more infrastructure means on-net you get more positive economic benefits, the app still has some unique margin of legitimacy that they can access. Does that make sense? Yeah? So in responding to what you were talking about earlier about other private investors joining, you can still win that you on net have more private investors. And then secondly, a response to the EU joining is that or I guess a continuation of offense is the US aid OPIC argument that the United States retaliates, and basically the way that they retaliate is by increasing their own aid abroad. So the EU joining and keeping the BRI afloat is really good because that increases the legitimacy of the BRI, and because the United States views the BRI as a legitimate threat to its power, the United States increases its own investment abroad, which is why under Trump, for example, OPIC funding, which is our own overseas investment agency, went up 60 billion, right? So then they run competition between superpowers is really good because they are competing on development aid. Then let's just get on to this final slide, which is perception links. So many people are running them, because perception links are really good for debaters. As debaters, we are all very good at BSing. We're very good at just making logic, and we're very good at making things sound like they're real. And that's why we like to run perception links, because you can get up there and talk about perception all you want, and you can say, this isn't based off of an empiric, it's a perception link. All we need is the perception to trigger our impact. So just as the funding link can open the door to competition and the United States increasing aid, one common perception link that this funding debate opens as a can of worms is the tariff debate, right? People run that the United States responds by increasing tariffs. So be careful, be ready. People will respond to your funding link with perception turns. I would say the way that you get out of these perception turns is one, reading more topic knowledge, but two, once you have that topic knowledge, you stop relying on perception. Because topic knowledge and topic arguments and topic-specific literature is specific to the topic for a reason. It is the experts on the topic, the people with the most knowledge on the topic, speaking specifically about the topic itself. So you are speaking about fact. When you speak about topic knowledge and topic arguments, you are talking about factual statements backed by empirics that really the other team needs evidence to get around. They can make analytical rebuttals all they want, but you have access to the true information about the topic. When you run a perception argument, it shows that you are uncomfortable with the topic literature and the topic base, so you're relying on your PF ability to just kind of BS and worm your way through everything to get around these arguments. I think that perception arguments are only going to last well, maybe through camp, before people start getting good responses to perception topics or perception links because they're reading topic knowledge. The best way to get around debate BS is to become a semi-topic knowledge expert, right? Obviously, you're not going to become as much of an expert as someone who's dedicated 6 years of their career in journalism towards writing about the topic. But if you can control more of the information in the round, if you know how the BRI functions, you know the history of the BRI, you know who's involved in the BRI, you know examples, and you know precedent, you are always going to beat these perception links because you can respond to perception links with perception responses, right? You can respond to Trump tariff arguments with alt causes, for example, but you can't respond to topic literature that's specific to the BRI with alt causes, because then what do? If it really comes down to an evidence debate, you say, okay, judge, look at the evidence. It's specific to the BRI. This isn't an alt cause. Whereas the other team, I guarantee you, is never going to have as complete control of a link. So at the end of the day, that is like my little 5-minute rant, where basically I'm saying perception links are all good and cool, and they demonstrate your ability as a debater to basically logically work your way through an argument. But if you want to beat these perception links, if you want to win tournaments and you want to win rounds, the way that you do so is becoming a topic knowledge expert and not a perception link expert. Because as this event becomes more technical, it becomes more critical, and it becomes more focused on evidence, which is why we're pushing things like cutting cards, and we're pushing things outside of the realm of just paraphrasing and finessing. These strategies that might have worked in the past, right, won't necessarily continue to work in the future, and a lot of you still have 2-3 years left in this activity. Maybe this is your last year, you will be able to get away with what you've been doing, but it looks like the general trend of this activity is moving away from perception BS and more towards topic knowledge. So that's my little 5-second rant at the end. Are there any questions about what we covered? All good? Y'all want to head out to cohorts? Yeah? Okay. We do have, oh,